Thank you so much. So yes, my name is Greg Wallace. As Dominique said, I'm an associate professor at the George Washington University in Washington, D.C. And today I'm going to be talking about aging and autism with a focus both on risks and resilience to suboptimal outcomes among autistic adults. I'll say that my cat is trying to join the meeting as well, so I don't know if I apologize. I'll just say that I welcome all people to the meeting, including my cat, who might have something to say. And I do apologize for that in advance. So more specifically today, I'm going to be discussing our findings to date on a couple of areas of, again, what I'll call risk, specifically co-occurring Parkinsonism and possible cognitive decline among autistic adults. I'll also be talking about aspects of what I've loosely termed resilience, which include compensatory approaches utilized by autistic people for executive function challenges they face in everyday life. But first, I'd like to provide a little bit of context. Children were first diagnosed with autism in the United States in the mid-1940s, though it wasn't until 1980 that autism was included in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or DSM, as an independent diagnosis. Therefore, most autistic people diagnosed as children have only relatively recently reached middle to older adulthood. Furthermore, the fact that autism is a relatively new diagnosis means that opportunities to study adulthood and particularly aging in autism have been very limited. Accordingly, the knowledge base on aging and autism is very small. To illustrate this, take a look at the figure here demonstrating the tiny number of studies focusing on aging and autism from a paper by David Mason and colleagues in 2022. So hopefully you can see my cursor here. I'm referring to this figure in the bottom left. You'll notice that the inset image is blown up from the larger figure as the line for people who are in older age of studies that includes autistic people of older age is so close to zero, you can barely see that it's different from the, the bottom horizontal line. So recent CDC-based estimates suggest that about 2.2% of adults in the United States are autistic, which equates to about 5.8 million adults. This includes more than 3 million adults who are 45 years of age or older. So overall, this is a very important yet neglected age range for studying autism, particularly given the number of adults affected and the rapidly aging United States population. So having provided that very brief context, I want to turn to the first area of potential, again, risk, I'll use air quotes, for suboptimal outcomes among autistic people as they age, namely co-occurring Parkinsonism. Let's start by defining Parkinsonism for those that are unfamiliar. Parkinsonism is an array of motor symptoms akin to those observed in Parkinson's disease. These motoric features include tremors, slowness in movement, and muscle stiffness. Thus, Parkinson's disease itself is one form of Parkinsonism. Also falling under this broader rubric is secondary Parkinsonism, which can arise due to chronic use of antipsychotics, particularly first-generation antipsychotics. This is an important consideration as autistic people are prescribed antipsychotics fairly frequently. One study indicated that 25 to 35% of autistic people are prescribed antipsychotics. So what do we know already about the overlap of autism and Parkinsonism? In the first study to examine this co-occurrence, Sergio Starkstein, Joe Piven, and colleagues examined Parkinsonism in 2 samples of autistic adults, one in Australia and one in the United States, using the gold standard neurological assessment of Parkinsonism, the Unified Parkinson's Disease Rating Scale. In one sample, about 16% of 50-plus-year-olds with autism met criteria for Parkinsonism. whether or not they were also taking antipsychotics. In the other sample, an even higher rate of 25 to 32% of 40-plus-year-olds with autism met criteria for Parkinsonism, whether or not they were also taking antipsychotics. Using United States Medicare data more recently, Brittany Hand and colleagues found a six-fold increase in Parkinson's disease diagnoses among older autistic adults compared to non-autistic adults. This discrepancy was even larger for autistic women than non-autistic women. This second study did not examine or control for effects of possible antipsychotics usage on the Parkinsonism co-occurrence rate. So in our own complementary study utilizing Spark's Research Match service, we collected self-report data online from autistic adults who were 40 years of age and older at the time of the study and who could independently consent for themselves. We did this in order to examine rates of Parkinsonism and its links to outcome metrics. After study exclusions, such as folks taking antipsychotics, the sample included 279 autistic adults ranging in age from 40 to 83 years, with an average age of 52 years. More than half of the sample was assigned female sex at birth. The 6-item Parkinsonism screening questionnaire was employed to evaluate features of Parkinsonism in this sample. The questions focus on stiffness in one's legs, tremors, difficulty buttoning buttons or dressing, lack of an arm swing when walking, feet being stuck on the floor or to the floor, and becoming slower in daily activities. Item level data from the Parkinsonism screening questionnaire are presented here from 3 groups. 2 of these groups, the control adults presented here in green, and adults with Parkinson's disease presented here in orange, are those from the original Berestinajad et al. 2014 study, which was the study that validated the use of the Parkinsonism screening questionnaire as a screening instrument. We've added and overlaid the data from our sample of autistic adults here in blue. As you can see, the autistic group is often self-reporting a much greater frequency of Parkinsonism features than the control group. So if we compare the blues to the greens, you can see they're higher across the board. However, of course, the endorsement rate in the autistic group never reaches the level of the Parkinson's disease group in orange, and nor should it. Taking this a step further, we sought to examine possible differences in real-world functioning for the autistic participants who screened positive for Parkinsonism, labeled here as PSQ+, versus those who screened negative, labeled here as PSQ-. As you can see right here, 31% of the autistic adults in this sample screened positive for Parkinsonism, even after taking into account those who are currently taking antipsychotics. In addition to the PSQ, participants also completed a battery of other self-report questionnaires, including measures of subjective quality of life, using the short form of the WHO's Quality of Life questionnaire, as well as the autism-specific scale, and everyday memory functioning using the prospective and retrospective memory questionnaire. First, we found that autistic adults who screened positive for Parkinsonism reported lower subjective quality of life across the board, but particularly in the areas of physical health, environment, and autism-specific factors, compared to those autistic adults who screened negative for Parkinsonism. Similarly, there were clear and robust effects of Parkinsonism group on memory, with the autistic adults who screened positive for Parkinsonism reporting lower prospective and retrospective memory functioning than those autistic adults who screen negative for Parkinsonism. So taken together, our data, along with the previously published studies, suggest that Parkinsonism is fairly common among middle and older age autistic adults. It's possible this heightened prevalence in autism is exacerbated in women with autism. These Parkinsonian motor symptoms are associated with overall poorer outcomes in autism during middle and older adulthood. These include decreased subjective quality of life and more memory challenges. Nevertheless, these are still new findings, relatively speaking, and many questions remain unanswered, including, is the age of onset of Parkinsonism earlier in autism than found in the general population? In follow-up data that I haven't presented here, that we're continuing to collect and sift through, we find that age of onset varies considerably based on the symptom queried for autistic adults. For example, it appears that becoming slower in daily activities, that question, is an item that's fairly frequently endorsed by these autistic adults, but it has a much later onset in mid to late life. In contrast, lack of an arm swing when walking, that's an item that's not endorsed very often by these autistic adults. And most often, when it has been endorsed, the onset is actually during childhood. So a related and critically important question is whether the Parkinsonism we are observing is neurodegenerative in many or only some or even a minority of cases. So in other words, we really need longitudinal studies to better understand the course and consequences of these motoric features that autistic people are describing and endorsing to inform clinical care and healthcare systems. We know that a lot of autistic people have motor symptoms across the lifespan. How much of this is interacting with, overlapping, or even overshadowing what we're seeing here? We really need to understand this to better better inform how it's dealt with clinically going forward. Okay. So next, I want to turn to a second area of potential risk for suboptimal outcomes among autistic people as they age, namely cognitive decline. So another open question about aging and autism was whether autistic people are at heightened risk for cognitive decline and dementia. Again, there is evidence from healthcare claims data in the United States that is a bit concerning. In that aforementioned study by Brittany Hand and colleagues from 2020, they used Medicare data from 65-plus-year-olds, and they found that autistic adults had an 8-fold increased risk for what was a cognitive disorder diagnosis. This includes dementia, delirium, amnesia, and other cognitive disorders. Furthermore, Giacomo Vivanti, Lindsay Shea, and colleagues using Medicaid data from 30 to 64-year-olds in the United States found that autistic adults appear to be at increased risk for early onset dementia using similar diagnostic codes from the medical records. However, these data come with caveats linked to the healthcare claims data, such as when and why these diagnostic codes were assigned, and the fact that a conglomeration of codes was used in both studies that include not only dementia per se, but also other conditions, such as delirium. We utilized a different approach in our research, which is to query autistic adults about their experiences of cognitive decline. Spark Research Match services were again used to recruit a sample of 210 autistic adults ranging in age from 42 to 81 years with an average age of 55. All of these autistic adults also participated in that Parkinsonism study I just described, but this study was completed 2 years later. Again, more than half the sample was assigned female at birth. These autistic adults completed the 88, which is designed to distinguish between individuals with and without early stage dementia. 88 self-rated items query whether individuals have experienced changes in thinking and memory in the last several years. The 88 has good diagnostic performance with sensitivity ranging from 80 to 85% and specificity ranging from 59 to 74%. The results described here were published in Autism Research, and this paper was written by Claire Klein, a doctoral student at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. So the conventional 88 cutoff score for concerns over cognitive decline is usually 1 or 2. So here are the cutoff scores. Among autistic adults in this sample, either 30% of those who scored 2 or higher, or 49% for those who scored 1 or higher, reported indications of cognitive decline. When comparing these results to those obtained in a comparable population-based but older sample from the United States, several of the items were endorsed much more frequently by autistic adults than non-autistic adults, as shown in the bar chart depicted here. So our current study is in this reddish color, and the general population is in this bluish teal, well, whatever. I'm not good with color. These included increasing problems in everyday thinking and memory here, and increasingly forgetting appointments, being more commonly endorsed in these autistic adults than in the general population sample. A foundational follow-up question to these results might be, what contributes to this potential elevated risk for cognitive decline among autistic adults? There are tons of candidates for that, and we hope to probe many of them going forward. But one colleague here who is critically important for all of the research I present is Dr. Goldie McQuaid, who's at George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia. She led these efforts, which includes another paper published in Autism Research. So we decided to start with looking at anticholinergic effects. Anticholinergic medications block acetylcholine at cholinergic receptors in the nervous system. Many common prescription and over-the-counter medicines have potent anticholinergic effects. Among older adults in the general population, anticholinergic medications are associated with cognitive impairment and risk for various forms of dementia. These cognitive effects are termed anticholinergic cognitive burden, or ACB. Given high rates of co-occurring medical and psychiatric conditions and high rates of polypharmacy across the lifespan among autistic people, they likely have a high anticholinergic exposure. Thus, they might be at high risk for anticholinergic cognitive burden. Nevertheless, no research to date has characterized anticholinergic exposure or examined its association with cognition in autism. Therefore, we decided to look at this in 3 ways. First, we looked at rates of anticholinergic medication usage in our time 1 sample of middle and older age autistic adults, as described, those who were described above in the Parkinsonism study. We also then examined associations between anticholinergic burden and ratings of current memory functioning and cognitive decline, as described in the prior study that occurred 2 years later. So, in the interest of time, I won't belabor the point. The basic summary here is to show you that autistic adults had high anticholinergic burden. About 63% of middle and older age autistic adults were taking medications with known anticholinergic effects. Using a well-established and validated scale, anticholinergic burden was rated using an ordinal scale. By using this scale, we found that those with the highest anticholinergic burden, those with scores of 3 or higher, reported more concurrent memory problems at time 1, based on the prospective and retrospective memory questionnaire, than those with moderate to lower anticholinergic burden ratings. Taking this a step further, we've then found that those with the highest anticholinergic burden reported more indication of cognitive decline on the 88 at time 2 than those with moderate to lower anticholinergic burden ratings. So alongside a couple of healthcare claims studies, our data reveal greater endorsement of increasing cognitive problems by middle and older age autistic adults, compared to a population-based comparison sample that was considerably older than the autistic group here. Furthermore, we find relatively high anticholinergic cognitive burden in middle and older age autistic adults. This increased anticholinergic burden is in turn linked with lower self-rated memory function and with indicators of increasing cognitive decline based on self-ratings provided 2 years later by these autistic adults. Okay, so I'm gonna now pivot away from risks and focus on resilience, and particularly resilience to suboptimal outcomes among autistic adults. And specifically here, I'm going to be focusing on evidence we are accruing about how autistic adults may compensate for everyday difficulties, including executive function challenges. So what do we mean by, I'm using the term compensation here. So what do we mean by compensation in this context? Lucy Livingston and Frankie Happe, in their overview of the concept of compensation among people with neurodevelopmental conditions, described it as people achieving typical or better than expected performance on a task through the recruitment of additional cognitive, psychological, neurobiological, or other resources. In other words, people are relying on other resources to compensate for challenges they might experience in one particular area. For example, autistic people might think of topics for small talk ahead of time when anticipating meeting new people. The notion of compensation or compensatory skills in autism is relatively new in research. Nevertheless, there have been notable examples of autobiographical accounts describing how autistic people mask or pass in a predominantly neurotypical world. As implied by these terms, compensation in autism has often been conceptualized vis-a-vis social differences linked to autism. In addition to masking and passing as autistic, other terms are used to describe such compensation, including adaptive morphing, social camouflaging, and social compensation. Let's center autistic voices by starting with autobiographical accounts of autistic lived experiences. These accounts describe many instances of pretending to be non-autistic or masking. These anecdotal accounts in turn spurred qualitative research, particularly on the experiences of social compensation, as well as quantitative research, including the development of self-report measures that are now widely used. The most prominent example is likely the Camouflaging Autistic Traits Questionnaire, or CAT-Q, which was developed by Laura Hull and colleagues. Importantly, compensation for social differences has been reported across the lifespan for autistic people, including studies of children, adolescents, and adults. The conceptualization of compensation in autism often focuses on ways an autistic person changes their own behavior. Accordingly, most of the measures we use to assess compensation focus on how autistic people change their own behavior to quote unquote compensate for everyday challenges they experience. This is akin to the medical model of disability, wherein the focus is entirely on the person with the disability, as opposed to the environmental and social barriers they face. However, how well a person fits within their environment is critical. This person-environment fit harkens to the neurodiversity perspective, wherein disability is partially dependent on how your brain fits in your own context, such as your culture, the time in which you are living or alive, the physical space within which you are functioning, etc. So this viewpoint is more akin to the social model of disability, wherein one focuses on social, environmental, and other barriers to optimal functioning. Thus, in our research, we want to create and utilize questionnaires that measure not only how people change their behavior to compensate for challenges they face, but also how they change their environment to do so. As I mentioned earlier, most conceptualizations of compensation autism focus narrowly, somewhat narrowly, on social differences rather than broader challenges across domains. Autistic people frequently cite other areas as representing barriers to optimal outcomes. Today, I'm just going to focus on one, although we did query several different areas. Today, I'm going to focus on executive function challenges. So, like I said, we therefore sought to investigate possible compensatory strategies and approaches that autistic people harness to combat challenges they experience in the area of executive function. The responses received to a series of questionnaires examining this area represents our quantitative findings. We also asked autistic people to provide information on their lived experience of other forms of compensation that we did not capture in our questionnaires. The responses provided by autistic adults to this open-ended question represent our qualitative findings. Thus, I'm now going to delve into our ongoing study on the broad topic of compensation skills in autism. So I want to, again, make it crystal clear. This study is being spearheaded by Dr. Goldie McQuaid at George Mason University. Very close collaborator. None of this would even be remotely possible without her. So she needs to get all the props. So our study hypotheses were as follows. We predicted that autistic adults would employ a wide variety of strategies to compensate for their differences in executive function. We also hypothesized that autistic people assigned female sex at birth would engage in more of these compensatory strategies than in those assigned male sex at birth. So for this study, we recruited autistic adults currently living in the United States who were aged 18 and older. We used targeted online recruitment strategies, and to ensure data integrity, the study utilized individualized study links, bot defeating tactics, and quality control measures. I bring that up because unlike the previously described studies, this sample of autistic adults was not recruited via Spark, which is a closed system, and we don't have to worry about those things as much as we do when we're recruiting in the community more broadly. So this study is ongoing. The 216 autistic adults who've provided data thus far range in age from 18 to 81 years, with an average age of 33 years. More than 2/3 of the people in the sample are assigned female sex at birth. About a quarter of the people in the sample identifies gender diverse. The sample is largely white and non-Hispanic. Over half of the sample has a bachelor's degree or greater educational attainment. To probe the use of strategies to compensate for executive functioning, or EF challenges, you'll see EF a lot in these slides, so that's executive functioning, we developed a new measure. This measure was co-produced with autistic researchers and is therefore informed by autistic people's lived experiences. The measure is made up of 17 items that capture two components of executive functioning: flexibility and emotion regulation. Flexibility includes how readily a person can switch between different cognitive processes or different tasks. Emotion regulation refers to a person's ability to effectively direct and modulate their emotional responses. Both of these areas have been noted by autistic people, both youth and adults, to be areas of challenge for them. So example items for this new measure include the following. For flexibility, we ask participants to rate how often they avoid new situations or environments. For emotion regulation, we ask participants how often they use a fidget or some object in order to calm or soothe themselves in new situations. I'm going to keep the results short and sweet. So turning to the results, here we see the overall profile of compensation for executive function challenges. Just to orient you, the horizontal or x-axis shows each of the two executive functioning domains. The vertical or y-axis displays the mean compensation score. Higher scores reflect more compensation. These profiles are plotted separately for autistic adults assigned female sex at birth, seen in the upper greenish line, and those assigned male sex at birth, seen in the lower purplish line. We find that overall, autistic adults assigned female sex at birth compensate more for executive function challenges relative to autistic adults assigned male sex at birth. We also see a difference in the profiles by assigned sex at birth. Autistic adults assigned female sex at birth compensate more for flexibility challenges relative to emotion regulation challenges, whereas those assigned male sex at birth show the opposite pattern. So now I'm going to move on to the second part of this study, which focuses on qualitative data. So in addition to the questionnaires employed in the quantitative study described above, we also ask autistic adults to describe other strategies they use to compensate for or cope with day-to-day challenges. This open-ended question provides rich, complementary, and contextualizing information to the findings we reported above. Of 216 autistic adults who completed the questionnaire described earlier, 126 of them provided responses to our open-ended question about other strategies they use. These responses were organized by Dr. Goldie McQuaid thematically. They represent experiences from both assigned birth sexes and a variety of gender identities, as well as a range of ages, 18 to 80 years in this case. First, autistic adults frequently discuss the use of executive function strategies like careful planning. This planning was used when going into an unfamiliar or new setting, as well as to preserve energy and facilitate smooth transitions between tasks or events. Autistic adults also discuss the importance of routines and familiarity. This included keeping one's living environment controlled, staying within a familiar setting like one's neighborhood, and maintaining routines and schedules. Autistic adults also indicated the importance of having a friend or other familiar person join them when going to new places. For the executive function domain of emotion regulation, autistic adults reported using music or other types of media to regulate emotions. This included repeatedly listening to favorite music or watching favorite programs. Autistic adults also indicated the importance of having breaks and time to themselves to regulate emotions. Stimming was mentioned by many autistic adults as a way to promote positive emotions and dampen negative emotions. Autistic adults reported using different types of stims, including verbal stimming. One participant referred to allowing themselves to stim. Another mentioned deciding not to live with roommates so that they could freely stim. These examples draw attention not only to the importance of stimming as an emotion regulation activity, but also the impacts of a neurotypical society that can lead autistic people to feel the need to suppress this helpful activity. So based on these qualitative data, we find autistic adults provided a wealth of additional information on strategies they use in compensating for challenges they experience on a daily basis. Many of the reported strategies involved activities of enjoyment, repetition, or engagement that self-soothe and calm. Many others involve adaptation of one's environment or their autistic person's fit with that environment. So taken together based on this very brief overview, it was very brief, of existing published studies and the preliminary results from our own research. Like I said, autistic people report a really wide variety and rich array of compensatory strategies and techniques. These approaches, often termed masking or camouflaging in the research literature, are increasingly well characterized for autistic people's social differences. But complementing this existing research, our own study begins to describe approaches utilized by autistic people to compensate for differences in executive functioning and actually other areas as well. Autistic people assigned female sex at birth are reporting greater use of compensatory approaches. And this appears to be across all domains relative to autistic people assigned male sex at birth. This is from prior studies of masking and social camouflaging, as well as our own studies of executive functioning and other areas. Why autistic people assigned female sex at birth report more compensation is an open question. However, one possible explanation may be found in differences in social norms and expectations based on one's birth sex. We also want to acknowledge caveats and limitations of our own research. There are many I could put up here, but I'll start with a couple. For example, the studies I've presented here were largely limited to autistic adults without co-occurring intellectual disability, which of course only represents the lived experience of some people on the autism spectrum. Therefore, an important future direction for research is to investigate how all of these findings apply to autistic people with co-occurring intellectual disability. We're in the process of addressing some of this ourselves through another collaboration with Spark. Based on proxy reports, we find among autistic adults who cannot consent for themselves, we're finding very similar screen positivity rates for Parkinsonism. We also find relatively high endorsement rates of concerns over cognitive decline. How compensatory strategies and approaches might differ for autistic people with co-occurring intellectual disability has yet to be queried, but it is an important future direction for research. Another limitation of our research is that autistic adults in our study identified as predominantly white and non-Hispanic, and many were highly educated. This is, again, a limited perspective in the sense of it represents the autistic lived experience for a subset of the population. So we want to really increase our outreach efforts to better represent minority ethno-racial experiences in our research. So overall, our knowledge of adulthood and aging in autism is limited, but it's beginning to emerge. There are a plethora of risks to suboptimal outcomes, but also points of resilience. Much more work is needed to understand aging in autism and prepare our various service systems to optimize outcomes for autistic adults. I have lots of acknowledgements. I'll start with Spark. Spark was critical, their collaboration in making this happen. There's many people I could name, but I'll just say Spark because there's so many people that have been super helpful for us in our research. And perhaps more importantly, or most importantly, the adults, the autistic adults who are part of Spark and their willingness to participate in our research is critical for us to understand what is going on and to help disseminate the knowledge we gather as we gather it. We're also really grateful to the autistic adults who weren't necessarily in Spark, who came to us from the community for our study on resilience, meaning our study on compensation and autism. Particularly the qualitative, those open-ended responses where they provided all of these individualized compensatory techniques. That qualitative information is so helpful to help us understand how autistic people are functioning in everyday life and compensating for the challenges they face on a daily basis. And I, of course, want to thank my lab and all the students in my lab, and there's been many of them who've worked on these data over the years. And then lastly, I particularly want to shout out again, Dr. Goldie McQuaid, who's been involved in all of this research from the get-go, as well as Claire Klein, who worked particularly closely with us on the cognitive decline data that I described. So for more information about our lab and my email address, and there's even a QR code you can use. And I'm going to stop there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wallace. This was really, really very interesting, and we've had a lot of chatter in the Q&A, a lot of questions from folks. So I'm going to do my best to try and ask questions in the order of the presentation. So starting with some of the risk-related study questions and then the resilience-related study questions. But as questions come in, I might go a little out of order. So I'll do my best. But
No worries.
okay, so starting with the study on Parkinsonism, can you talk a little bit about any differences you might have found in sex and gender of
Oh,
participants in
yes.
the study?
So we did actually find, I didn't mention that, and I thought about putting it in, but I ran out of time, which is just to say that we did find that autistic people assigned female sex at birth were endorsing more of these Parkinsonism symptoms than those assigned male sex at birth, which is not the general pattern you see in the broader population. It tends to be more Parkinson's disease. Let me be clear, because these are two separate things, or at least overlapping things. Parkinson's disease is more prevalent in men. So we do see that. And what that might mean, I'm not sure. This is why we really need to look at these data longitudinally to understand how much of what we're seeing is represented by pre-existing motor challenges and how much of this is something that's of a concern where it could be changing over time in a way that's neurodegenerative or more concerning.
And did you notice any, or did you find any differences in people who maybe were just generally more physically active versus those who were perhaps not? Was there any findings related there?
We did not ask about, it's a great question, but we did not ask about, that I can recall, about physical activity. What I will tell you that's kind of interesting, I didn't mention this either, is we only had 2 people who disclosed that they'd had a Parkinson's disease diagnosis. And I mean, for what it's worth, those 2 people, of course, also screened positive on the Parkinsonism screening questionnaire. But I don't have an answer. That's me sidestepping because I don't have an answer to that question about physical activity. Oh, I have one more. I will say that we do, this is, again, is not physical activity per se, but we did find in our 2-year follow-up study that folks who screened positive for Parkinsonism at time one were more likely 2 years later to experience falls, which is kind of an important outcome metric we think about as people age. So again, not answering your question, but just giving you more information.
Still certainly interesting and related information to have. So thank you. Let's see here. And so we got a lot of questions, so I'm trying to,
All good.
I can do the best I can for everyone here. So you spoke about, you had the folks from the Parkinsonism study also participated in the follow-up study, which was, I believe, 2 years apart, correct? Yeah.
Yes, correct.
So I just want to get the facts before I ask the question here from folks. So what was the overall just consensus of the general connection between Parkinsonism and the other and the issues? Like, why was that the chosen cohort to continue with, and how did that what was the overall findings there in that connection?
Okay, so I didn't describe about a connection per se, to be fair, other than just saying that the samples overlapped, meaning the people who participated. What we were trying to do is kind of like what I'm telling you. So actually, right now, we are still at the end of collecting data that are 4 years after our initial data collection. So that first Parkinsonism study happened right before the pandemic began. And so we are following these folks up 4 years later right now and collecting data on them. Now, again, I didn't mention it in the talk for the interest of time because I could talk about many, many, many things, and some things we just have not gotten to. But there is a connection. Those folks who reported more Parkinsonism symptoms were also reporting more concerns over cognitive decline. So there was a direct connection in that sense. It's not causal, right? It's still correlational, but it is over time. So people who endorsed more Parkinsonism symptoms at time one endorsed more cognitive decline 2 years later. But our broader picture, because I'm not quite sure which part you're asking about, so I'll answer it in two ways. That's my first way. The second way I'll answer is to say that, the rationale for the broader study that we're doing, and we're looking at a lot of things. I'm only cherry picking pieces of data to describe here. We have a bunch of data on mental health and other things that is not described here pretty much at all. For example, what we were trying to do is target things that either autistic people have raised as concerns, or that the literature, the scientific literature, or both have indicated as possible concerns. So, and that's also why I called it risks, because these are the two most common neurodegenerative conditions as we age, are dementia, particularly of Alzheimer's type, but dementias or cognitive decline. And then the second would be Parkinson's disease. So this was more of a broad take, trying to understand what the aging process or aging concerns might be for autistic people. One thing I didn't talk about that's another, you could almost think about it as a resilience factor that is from the Spark data, is we did find that social support, for example, we examined social support in these middle and older age autistic adults, and we find that increased social support, not quantity, but quality. What I mean by that is that it isn't just the number of people that you interact with on a daily, weekly, monthly basis, but it's the quality of the relationships that you have with these people that is positively correlated with your subjective quality of life, meaning the higher quality social support that you're experiencing as an autistic adult, then the more likely you are to describe your quality of life as better, if that makes sense. So we do see protective factors in that way as well, which is very similar, slightly different, but very similar to the general population, where quantity also matters, not just quality. Whereas it seems like with autistic people, based on our first study, quality really, really matters, and quantity less so.
I'm so glad you brought up that social support piece, because that actually leads to the next question I wanted to share from an attendee. So the quality of social support, but you also find that connection for these older autistic adults with other neurodivergent people feeds into that quality and their resilience to stressors, or is that not something that has come about?
Well, no. This is a failure for us, not a failure of anything else. I can make a speculative answer. I don't have a quantitative answer based on our own data. I have a strong suspicion that that is part of that qualitative social support. What am I trying to say? The quality of social support, I bet, is, if not with other people who are neurodivergent, at least other people who are neurodivergent affirming, is a huge part of that higher quality of social support. But I don't have that. We didn't ask that specific question, so I cannot answer that in an evidence-based way from our data. There is some data that sort of converges with that notion from other labs and other studies, no doubt. I don't know if it's been looked at in aging autistic people per se.
Thank you. And then we've got a few questions from people just about a few different things they're looking for just some examples of. So I guess for starters, can you describe what tremors in Parkinsonism might look like?
I think the best way to see that see an example of that is actually, frankly, to do a Google search. So I think you should do a Google search, look at some of the Parkinson's Disease Foundation sites and places like NINDS, and you'll see, or the Michael J. Fox Organization for Parkinson's Disease, places like that, or foundation. Those are places where you can not just see it, but you can actually see examples. So you could actually see videos of the kinds of symptoms we're talking about when we're talking about tremors. But it is shaking. That's why I don't want to try to boil it down to a verbal description. I'm worried I'm going to do it just not do it justice. But it is this more of a shaking motoric symptom. You know, there are other conditions. Let's take something like essential tremor. That tremors are a symptom, but that doesn't mean it's Parkinson's disease. Essential tremor, my own examples from family members are things like some people will have their head will shake. It'll shake like a little bit like this. That's a different kind of tremor than the kind you can see in Parkinson's disease. But it can look similar when it's hand and arm. So it really depends. It depends on the person, the context, everything else. So this differential becomes really important, and you really need a neurologist consultation to discern what is going on. So that's why I would, again, send people online to look for actual real world examples.
Definitely. And I think you gave some great examples of some specific sites where people can go. So another question was, this is more related to I just believe this was more related to one of the resilience studies. Examples of like verbal stimming, what that would be considered, or what that was reported as.
Well, so that could just be repeating the same phrases. It could be, I mean, it's almost like, you know, it's almost like your own little mantras, or it could be almost like this, the equivalent of a self-talk. But it could also, it just depends. These things can be super idiosyncratic when you get to examples, because it's not one thing. Whereas when it comes to motoric stems, you tend to see some overlap across individuals, not always. But those verbal stems can be, it could be sounds. It doesn't have to be words, right? It can be a lot of different things.
Thank you. And sticking with the second portion of the talk with the resilience, what do you think are factors that contributed to limited racial diversity in the EF Challenges survey?
Oh, I think this isn't unique to autism research. I think this is more broadly an issue of research in general. Is when you're doing online research, not just online, even in person, it tends to skew towards particularly people who are higher socioeconomic status in this country. So, and there's all kinds of factors. And I mean, we've seen a lot of this play out for all kinds of reasons. There's also sometimes in certain minority communities, distrust of the medical establishment, which, not that that's what I would say, for example, we represent, but people might view it that way, right? So there could be distrust of certain other individuals in the community, whether it's academia or a medical setting, etc. But I think the part that's maybe that some people focus on is in our study, we get in our online study, and particularly adults, we get a lot more people assigned female sex at birth who are autistic that participate. That is a common pattern, which is flipped from particularly pediatric studies. I think this is even represented in the broader Spark cohort when you compare children versus adults. Now, the adults meaning what Spark calls independent, the adults who can consent for themselves. You get much more female representation than you do in the pediatric cohort. And that's for a lot of reasons. I think at least one of those is the fact that, you know, classically, traditionally, those assigned female sex at birth were not included in autism research much at all for a very long time. That's way different now. So that's another bias, if you will, in our sampling that I think is a good thing, to be honest, because we're getting better representation of a group that hasn't traditionally been a part of research. But it also is, you know, it's important to think about that because, like one of our findings is that these women are reporting a lot more compensation for their challenges in everyday life, including executive function, but also social and other things we looked at: sensory, compensation for sensory issues, compensation for daily living skill challenges. I hope that ramble somewhat hit the target.
Absolutely. Thank you. I think we have time for maybe one more question, and then this is actually interesting. I know for at least one of the studies, if not all of them, so you can correct me in your response, there was an average age of about 55 and change years, but the span, the actual band of ages was much larger. So for some of those adults who were maybe on the larger end, that perhaps were diagnosed later, or, autism just wasn't as prevalent when they were, maybe could have got a diagnosis when they were younger, but just didn't have the access. Did you notice a difference in the degree of cognitive decline in those folks versus maybe some of the people that were on the younger end of that age band?
So I'm just trying to disentangle these two things.
Yeah.
So,
Sure.
so those first couple studies, let me first say that the first couple studies were only people who were 40 and older. So the Parkinsonism and the cognitive decline. The resilient study, the one that was, compensation, which is not what they're probably talking about, that one actually was all of adulthood was represented. Okay. So let's stick to the middle and older age adults, meaning 40 plus. So it's a great point about the age of diagnosis. I did not mention that and should have, is just to say that we had a full range of ages of when autistic people were diagnosed, but there was certainly more people who were diagnosed as adults, particularly because the sample that I presented data on here are those who are who can consent for themselves. So many of them went undiagnosed as children and did not get recognized either until adolescence or even young, and even some cases middle and older adulthood was their first age of autism diagnosis. Part of that is they're not getting caught. Another, of course, is huge cohort effects in how autism diagnostic criteria have changed over time, and awareness of what is this full spectrum of autism. So things like Asperger's, et cetera, were not part of this autism spectrum way back when in the 80s, et cetera. So we didn't, so this is all this ramble just to say that it's a great question. We didn't ask the question quantitatively in the way that questioner has presented it. My concern, if I'm just going to be like really self-critical, would be that actually, if anything, the age of the person, whenever you do this is an issue with all of aging related research, is that you tend to have folks who are older participating in research who are quote unquote healthier. And it's because they can participate in research. They can get online and fill out a questionnaire. They can do this. Whereas so in other words, you have a loss of people over time who are having more difficulties. So this attrition in the study is not arbitrary, but in fact, you end up losing people who could be having more problems because they don't have the time, the resources, the skills, go down the list to actually keep participating in studies. I didn't answer your question. It's more or less an I don't know, but it's a great question.